I wanted to talk about one of the biggest mistakes I see students making with LSAT logic games. Most students don't diagram enough. I see really smart people trying to do everything in their heads, but it just doesn't pan out when there's too much arbitrary information and not enough time to solve the questions. You can only hold something like 4 to 8 pieces of information in your head at once. And that's using memorization techniques already, like chunking, for like phone numbers, for example. But when it comes to the LSAT with all its arbitrary rules, that's one step. On top of that, you have to make inferences. And then you have to imagine different hypotheticals for different specific situations. And you can't do all of this cold. You need some foundation. You need some main diagram for pretty much any question type. And then you need to be able to make adapted local versions or more specific versions of that diagram for particular questions. You have the space, you have the freedom to diagram, make use of it. Diagramming is your friend, and there's a clear advantage to doing so. If I see students try to do things in their heads, maybe they can knock out the easy orientation questions, but not the others. And one blind test taker even sued LSAC because he said that logic games were especially problematic for him, given that he wasn't able to see, and that that LSAC was not making sufficient accommodations for him. So given that most of you watching this probably don't have that issue, take full advantage of the opportunity you have to diagram. That's not changing with the digital LSAT. There will still be scrap paper, so you'll still be able to make use of that. And at the moment, with the paper and pencil format, you have 2 pages for logic games. So plenty of space to make your diagrams. Again, make use of it. One of the biggest mistakes I see students making with LSAT logical reasoning is that they're spending way too long on the easiest questions in the section. One of the nice things about LSAT logical reasoning is that the questions are in a general order of difficulty. Not a perfect order, but a general order. So you can still trust that the first 10 questions are going to be quite a bit easier than the tougher ones later in the section, especially in the late teens and early 20s. But if you spend your average of a minute 25 or so on each of the easy questions, then you'll only have that same amount of time on the tougher questions that come later. And it takes more time to do harder questions than easier ones. So if you want to have 2.5, maybe even 3 minutes to tackle some of those toughest logical reasoning questions, you've got to make up that time or build up that time, bank that time from the easiest questions earlier in the section. I typically recommend for students aiming for 165 plus to try to do the first 10 questions in about 10, maybe up to 12 minutes or so. That helps you save up some time or bank some time to use for the toughest questions at the end of the section. And speaking of order of difficulty and how that affects your pacing, one other thing I would consider is don't let yourself get bogged down by the hardest questions in the middle. If something is giving you trouble and it's not sticking, skip it, come back to it later at the end when you've knocked out all the questions that are easier for you. It doesn't make sense to invest 2-3 minutes in the moment on a tough parallel question when there are a couple of shorter and easier questions coming up right after it. I see students making some big mistakes when they approach LSAT reading comprehension questions, and I wanted to address some of those today in the hopes that it'll help you LSAT studiers out there avoid making these mistakes as you continue your LSAT prep. Most students make way too many markings on the reading comprehension passage. If you underline or highlight or circle things, you're probably trying to indicate that those things are important. But when you reread your notes later, when you reread the passage later, and you see those markings, you might be under the misconception that you thoroughly understand that part and then skip it in the future, when in reality, that's the most important part of the passage for you to focus on. There's also the issue that you can't unsee markings on the page. So if you've already made a marking and later reread the passage with a different intention from a different perspective, you won't be able to unsee your markings and you'll be distracted by them. It also takes way too much time to make all those markings. If you spend any longer than 3 minutes on your initial read of the passage, you're giving yourself significantly less than 1 minute per question. And so you don't want to overinvest yourself in your initial read of the passage. Another big mistake I see students making with LSAT reading comprehension is they're approaching the questions in the order given, not in the order that makes sense. You want to start with your global questions being your main idea, primary purpose, passage organization questions, then move on to the local or detail-oriented questions, and finally, the inferential questions that require a bit more reading between the lines, including the ones that are more similar to LSAT logical reasoning questions. So again, minimal markings, especially on the digital LSAT. Don't fool around with the highlighting and underlining tools. Those are just going to waste your time. And then secondly, the order in which you approach the questions. Don't do the order given. Do the order that makes sense, attacking and grabbing your lowest hanging fruit first. Anyway, I hope you found that helpful. If you did, please subscribe and click the notification bell so that you'll be notified of all future videos as I release them. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to email me personally. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.